Hello, I'm Rick Bine. I'm on the faculty at IUPUI, the Geography Department. And I want to tell you about my experience in the Peace Corps, how that got started, and how that led me on to where I am today. Probably an experience that totally changed my life. I grew up in Colorado and had gone through a couple of years of college and a very mediocre performance there. And after the second year, I just didn't really want to know what I wanted to do. And somebody suggested I try the Peace Corps. I said, "Think they'll take me without a college degree?" And he says, "Well, they're looking for people that have agricultural experience. And not many Americans have that kind of experience. So you would be valuable to them." So anyway, I applied, and lo and behold, 6 weeks later, they said, "Show up in Milwaukee in 10 days and start your Peace Corps training. Well, here's your ticket." And so I flew to Milwaukee, and there was about 20 of us there, and studying to be, going to all be ag extensions. We're all farm kids and from all over the country, mostly Midwest, but I was probably one of the furthest west, being in Colorado. And we went through this training of learning Portuguese and the cultural things, and got sort of a lot of things together. We even had a little bit of tropical agriculture lectures and this sort of thing, because we're looking at the tropics now rather than the temperate climate that we have here. Where we were coming down here is the tropics, the equator's right up here, and so it is at opposite seasons even. So we were. So after the training, they flew us down to Rio, and we were located here, and we stayed there for about a week. And a nice time there, a lot of lectures and things, but we also had plenty of time on our own, and went out and visited Rio and got to see the town and see the slums and see the different aspects of Rio itself, the culture itself. Rio is unique, a unique city in Brazil. It used to be the capital at one point before Brasilia became the capital. And well, here's Rio. Brasilia's up here, so they moved it up there so it'd be more congenial with the rest of the country, because Rio was unique to itself and had its own culture and whatever, and a lot of traditions that were there and didn't really match up with the rest of the country, so they decided to move it. But we had a great time in Rio, looking at all the things that were going on, and going down to the beach, and just different things that were there, and mixing with the culture. And so that was this area in here. And then after a week, they flew us out to the interior out here. Now, what was interesting, we came to Campo Grande, but the original plan was they were going to take us up here to the northeast of Brazil. But we arrived there like end of November, and they had a military coup earlier in the year, back in like April or May, and the new dictator had overthrown an elected president, and the elected president was the one who had agreed to do the Peace Corps there, and they'd been doing it for a couple of years already, but the new dictator didn't know what this was. He thought this was kind of invasive, maybe kind of socialism or whatever it was, communism. They didn't know what we were all about. So instead of letting us go up into the troubled areas up in here, they put us out here in the west where we couldn't hurt very much. And that was along the edge of the Pantanal over here. And so we were just on the edge of the Brazilian plateau. You could see the plateau, this tan sort of ochre color all the way up through here. And it's higher areas. It's actually steeper over here. It's the highest part not just inland from the coast. But anyway, where we were about 1,000 feet high already. So, but anyway, we went to Campo Grande, and we spent another week there, getting used to that place and talking to different people. And our director was still trying to sort us out as to where they were going to send us. And so finally, we went up this. I don't know if you can see this little red road here. That was the only road connecting the north to the south. The north was called Cuiabá, and the second city was Campo Grande. Today they've divided it into two states. Campo Grande is the capital of southern Mato Grosso. But anyway, I ended up being up in this village here along this Taquari River here, and worked there in that village, doing different things. People accepted me. I went to work with a Brazilian ag extensionist, and so we worked in a little building called Casa de Lavoura, and that's in Portuguese, but it means house of crops. And so that was in the main street of town there. It was all paid for the state government, and they had allowance for supplies and whatever. And they paid his salary. Peace Corps paid my salary, and we just survived. Actually, my Peace Corps salary was a little bit more than his government salary. Not much, but we were in the little town on the main street and did different things. We got out in the countryside and visited farms and saw what people were doing, and had little projects that we got started on. And getting in and out of the town was not an easy process, because you had to ford several rivers and streams, and the buses would go through the water. If it was flooded, we had to wait till the flood went down before we could move in. And the bus only we only had a bus that came in 3 times a week. So they had to wait for those if you wanted to get in and out. And so what kind of projects did we do? Well, we got out to some of the farms there. We saw a lot of the cattle ranching going on. That was a big process there. The landscape was one that was made up of, in this interior Brazil here, a kind of vegetation. It's kind of has a dry season here. It's different from the Amazon, which is rainy all the time. But we got down here, it had a summer rainy season and a winter dry season. And so it made a different kind of vegetation. And they called it, we would normally call this a savanna climate sort of thing. But in Brazil, they called it campo cerrado. It's sort of a misnomer because it means closed field. But it wasn't really closed. They were essentially these stunted trees that grew maybe at the most 20 feet high. And they were, we would call fire-daphic. Fire-daphic means that they were dependent on fire to survive. And so this area would burn periodically, and it allowed the seeds that they released to open up and germinate. So without the fire, this forest would die out. And it also had grasses growing in there in between. So it didn't totally shade out the ground. So this Campo Cerrado prevailed through this vast area here. Today, that area has been totally taken over. The trees are all gone. It's made into growing soybeans there. And Brazil is now the leading soybean producer in the world. We used to be the major producer here in the United States. We still produce a lot of soybeans, particularly here in Indiana. But Brazil has taken over the lead in this. And a lot of this interior area all converted into soybeans. But what was happening back then, before there were soybeans? And in fact, I'll just tell you, there weren't any soybeans when I got there. And the Peace Corps sent me up a little packet of soybean seeds. And we passed them out. And we actually several little packets, and we passed them out to some of the farmers. They started growing soybeans. And I guess it caught on. But I guess we were there to try to help expand agriculture and whatever. But it really, I'm a little bit dismayed at the total destruction of this Campo Cerrado and what they were doing to destroy it. And you can see pieces where they've gone in and done different things there. There was other activities going on in the community there. The main crop at this time was rice. And you think, well, rice? Well, that's Oriental rice. No, this is what they call upland rice, which doesn't need any irrigation. You grow it during the rainy season, and it does well, and this provided the food that they eat. And rice and they grow beans as well. Rice and beans is the staple of the Brazilian diet. You don't have a meal in Brazil without rice and beans. So every place they make sure they've got rice and beans to take care of them. And so they did that, and That was about all they were doing for a while. But one of the things they did was when they cleared the forest, that's what they would plant first right off, because the forest when it was burned, it'd leave ashes. Those ashes were like fertilizer, and rice and beans would do well there. But then later on, what would happen is the nutrition in the soils would be washed out by the rain, and the crops taking out most of the nutrition. It couldn't grow many crops anymore, so they would have to move. They call this shifting cultivation, and they go clear another patch. What happened to the old patch? Well, if it left it alone, the old composite would grow back in there. And because they were burning, and so they encouraged those trees to grow. But as it turned out, the ranchers would take it over and plant grasses there. And these grasses were invasive. They came from Africa, and they had no natural predators, so they would just take over, and it wouldn't allow the natural vegetation to take over, to begin to return. So, and also they burned it. You think that would help those other trees, but this grass was so vigorous, it just crowded out the trees before they could get started. And every now and then you'd get one of these old, they called them lichera trees, would grow up and be out there in the middle of the grass area. But it was largely a grassland area and pasture and all the cattle that were there. So, and these are cattle with the humps on their back. They're zebu cattle, they call them, but they came from India, domesticated there. And they're very different from the European cattle that we have in this country with the Herefords and the Angus and Shorthorn, which are all our beef animals, and the dairy cows, the Hereford and Guernseys, and so on. And so none of those cattle survived in this part of Brazil. In the very far south, yes. But up here, that was up in here, this was the kind of cattle that they had there. So these cattle were very important there. Horses were important, and they moved the cattle around and whatever, and controlled them in that way. In fact, Peace Corps, they were going to get me. They didn't have many vehicles, and so some of the volunteers got to have a kind of a little vehicle that could four-wheel drive kind of thing. They didn't give me one, and they got me a bicycle at first, but then as it turned out, it couldn't go very much. It was just the roads they were all dirt and sand, and you know, nothing smooth to drive on, so, or to ride on. So finally they got me a horse. So I had a horse that I moved around on quite a bit there, and I was pretty good at handling horses as growing up, so it worked out real well. And so that was my transportation, was the horses. So I got to go out and see a lot of the different farms on the horses, and had a lot of different experiences there. And I've got another story on that horse that was there that maybe we'll get to someday. But anyway, they had another activity, was the diamond mining, and people would go along the edge of the streams there and then get the gravels. And they would shift them in these big sieves like this. And they'd have about 4 of them, bigger holes, and then smaller holes. And there was always, they'd look at the bigger ones, and they'd have the bigger gravel in there, and they'd look around for a diamond. They rarely found anything like that. But when they got down to the 4th one, the real smaller gravel pieces, they would occasionally find a little diamond in there, and they would sell those and make a little money. And we call those garimperos, and they were the ones that survived from diamond mining. And a lot of them lived in the village, but they would go out to the riverside and do their mining. And so that was another activity that went on there. And so they were doing different things. Some of the projects that I got into was gardening. We got the kids to start raising vegetables. And these are like 12, 14-year-olds, somewhere in that age group. We started a little 4-H club, and we got these vegetable seeds and started planting them and showed them how to put it together and all that. And at the end of the season, they had a lot of lovely vegetables, different things, and beans, string beans, and tomatoes, and I guess trying to remember all the different vegetables we had. And they were delighted with that, and they would eat them there. But then they took them home, and the families weren't used to those vegetables. They didn't know how to cook them, how to prepare them, so they sort of refused them. So that was a little part of it was a little bit sad, because we couldn't get that, the final part of it was getting people to use that in their diets. But the kids learned about it. And so maybe now that they've grown up, I'm sure they are including that. And each one of them would have their own little garden in the backyard with those sorts of things growing. So it took some while to make change happen. Another project I had was with the cotton. The Ministry of Agriculture there in the state said, hey, we've got somebody that wants to buy cotton. If you grow cotton out here, we'll buy it from you. And so I got one of the shopkeepers to be a depot for this, and he agreed to do this. And they would send the seeds to him, and he would distribute them to the farmers, and they would go out and plant them. And when they got around to harvesting them, you can see this big truck that's full of, they're all full of cotton, taking out of town to bring money back to the village. So this was one thing that was particularly successful. I don't know if they're still growing cotton there, because it's kind of like the soybeans have taken over. But it'd be interesting to see what's happening there. And so it was a fantastic opportunity to participate in all these things. And I think the most fabulous part of this experience was learning Portuguese. And living in the village, not anyone spoke any English, so I went months and months without speaking English. And I became pretty ingrained in the language. And I'm fluent in it. I still am. After all these years, I can still speak it. And actually, I did another thing. It has nothing to do with this particular project, but I took a semester, a sabbatical, to go over to Mozambique, where they also speak Portuguese. And I was teaching in Portuguese at the university there, and they thought I was Brazilian because my accent is Brazilian. But anyway, I'm rather proud of that. But so I still I've gone back to Brazil and have a number of times talking to people and communicated a lot with the Brazilians here on campus. So this is the experience of Peace Corps really opened me up. It let me know about the rest of the world and how to do things from your rural provincial area, farming town in Colorado, to come in and be more worldly and begin these sorts of things. So it allowed me to do my dissertation work, to go back down to Brazil and do that 6 years later. And then my first job was in Africa, and then I've returned to Africa again, and ultimately I've spent 12 years in the tropics doing different things and working with the environment and teaching geography, and this has been my life. And so Peace Corps led me into a whole different area. My dad was disappointed that I didn't come back and take over the family business, but I was having too much fun working in universities and teaching and whatever. So that's my Peace Corps experience, and I can't say enough good things about it.